Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here. I really am. This is my first trip to Nashville, and I left New Haven at about 5 a.m. this morning, and it was 7 degrees, and there were piles of snow everywhere. And if you all think it's cold, and it is cold for Nashville, but you're not walking around in a refrigerator. So I'm very, very happy to be here, and I'm so happy to accept this invitation to give the Bogitsh lecture because when I read what it was about, I thought, oh, yeah, that makes sense. And I get to see my friend Emily, and I'm thrilled that they're family members here, so thank you for coming. Any chance to reunite with Emily is a good thing. I don't have to tell you what you have in her. You had the good sense to bring her to Vanderbilt, so you already know. Emily's deeply missed by many friends and colleagues, and I miss her like crazy. She was my lower your blood pressure person when I first got to Yale, and couldn't make hide nor hair of some of what was mysterious about that place. And it was Emily that helped me settle. Whether she's preaching, praying, lecturing, or administrating, she brings individuals and groups to a place of light and restoration. To know Emily is to be invited into a place where one can experience a deep sense of radical justice and fierce love, as our colleague Harry Attridge noted at her installation. So thank you, Emily. And I want to say thank you to Emily's staff, and especially to Shatika, who was here, who made everything run so smoothly. It was seamless, so I'm very grateful. So Emily said she'd let me give the title. It's a long title if you read the poster. When We Do Not Know What We Do Not Know, Religiously Literate Leadership in a Multi-Faith World. I'm hoping to host a kind of conversation about the look, feel, edges, promise of committed interfaith work, and for the purposes of the Divinity School, to talk about it a little in the broader context of our vocational settings. It's a mouthful, but you haven't heard anything yet. I brought props, so we chaplains like to give things to people. We give candy, we give pens. So I brought a couple of props that you're welcome to take, and I'll explain a little bit more about this as we go on. And I also brought slides, and the slides are my attempt to try to bring you into these stories. I'm going to tell you some stories, but it's helpful to see the humans behind the words. And if I forget to queue up extra slides, please feel free to remind me. Just a little sense of the diversity that at least I work with at Yale. It's hard to make out the words, but the image is actually what I want you to look at. It's so varied. And you'll get in these calendars, you'll see that image is in the calendars. But think about that while I'm talking to you. So just last Thursday, exactly a week ago, as I was sitting down to put the last touches on this lecture, an email announcement popped up in my inbox. It was from the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University, and it said the following. Professor Jose Casanova will address how religions have moved from the Mosaic, monotheistic distinction of true and false religion and the related system of classification of one true religion in contradistinction to all others, schismatics, Orthodox Christians, heretics, Protestants and other sects, infidels, Jews and Muslims, and pagans, idolatrous heathens, to a global system of religious pluralism and interreligious dialogue by revisiting the Chinese rites controversy and other Jewish encounters, or not Jewish, Jesuit encounters with the religious other. One sentence. I stared at the screen for a while and I thought, oh my Lord, I hope the good people at Vanderbilt aren't expecting anything like this. You are definitely not in the presence of a scholar of note like Professor Casanova. You are, however, in the presence of a veteran practitioner of interreligious engagement in the raw. And it's my hope that we engage with the bones of this material and that we also have some fun. This is my world. So that's a picture of my staff. We cook chili for for the student leaders of the residential halls. And we do it each summer. And this was not this past summer when they all came back. It's about 125 people that come into my backyard. This was the summer before. And in the middle of Ramadan, our Muslim chaplain, good egg that he is, donned a chili pepper outfit. This past year, we had our YDS intern wear it. But this just to give you a little taste of what we're about. Next slide. Okay, we'll hold that. So first, a confession. This seems like as good a place as any for such a thing, and well, I'm Catholic, as Emily noted, and so I tend to need to confess every once in a while. I gave today's lecture the title, When We Do Not Know What We Do Not Know, because I'm currently trying to construct a course with the same sort of pitch, starting from a place of humble acknowledgement that there is much we do not know of each other, and then figuring out how to offer religiously literate spiritual leadership in a multi-faith world that boasts many contours. Some of these contours delight us, and others demand a level of commitment and stamina that can tax us. I have the good fortune and privilege to be completely embedded in a multi-faith setting. The chaplaincy at Yale lives, breathes, and plans according to one central value. All people, no matter what their religious or spiritual tradition, deserve an authentic experience of welcome. We are acutely aware of the weight of Christian privilege that runs through nearly everything on our campus, from the architecture to the calendar. We are also aware that religious commitments from any tradition are often thought of as something that must be kept hidden in an academic setting, lest one be considered anti-intellectual. There are multiple tensions at play, and as I said, I have the good fortune to be embedded in the midst of it all. You should also know that I'm a worrywart. I worry about the big things, religious wars and conflicts, religious discrimination, multi-directional hate speech coming from inside and out of a religious group, and seemingly smaller things like what people will eat at a community dinner, religious holy day observances, the academic calendar, adequate prayer spaces, Sabbath observing students taking Saturday final exams. The list goes on and on. This afternoon, I'm going to weave two when we do not know what we do not know moments into my remarks. And then after some deeper digging, my hope is that we can engage in a conversation with one another. A while back, in the middle of a fall semester, I hit a low point. A student from one of our Christian groups on campus came to me and said, "Sharon, I do not want to help other religious groups do their jobs better. It would seem disloyal to my own, to the tenets of my faith. I'm uncomfortable with this whole notion." My heart sunk. I thought, how do I get through to this student that reaching out to someone so very different than oneself is not a bad thing? It does not go against what God has always asked of us, and yet again, it appears to be the deal breaker. The component of this holy interaction we're working so hard to cultivate that stops everything cold. The student came to me because of an exercise that the Interreligious Leadership Council had done together 2 nights earlier during one of their regular meetings. This group, the IRLC, is comprised of the student leaders of the many religious groups on campus, and they meet weekly over supper to swap notes about what it takes to lead a group and to take a stab at getting to know a bit more about each other as well as the multiple faith traditions they represent. The number about 25. They're a remarkable group of dedicated leaders, some from large religious organizations with hundreds of members, and others from smaller groups who are just trying to keep momentum going with modest involvement. I'm continually learning from them. Their perspective on the world we live in, on college life, and on their spiritual journeys is astounding to me. They live in the midst of such pressure and navigate intense complexities. There is constant competition for their time, their energy, and their spirit, from the demands of their intellectual pursuits to their extracurricular commitments. They take their obligations seriously, and they are incredibly thoughtful participants in this group, which is why I was so troubled by the student's earlier statement. Had we hit an impermeable barrier? Was the hope for the simple endeavor an illusion? Was I asking too much of them? The exercise was one in which we were all asked to talk together in pairs about the ups and downs of leading their respective groups. The goal was to exchange ideas and strategies for sustainable leadership for student religious organizations. The student who brought this concern to me was extremely thoughtful, and I knew it took some real courage to come and talk to me and honestly state how hard the exercise was. I did feel at a loss for the right words in response. She had been paired with a fellow student leader who happened to be Buddhist. Many of our groups lack large numbers, role models, or even adequate staff advisors. Checking in with peers has been quite important to them. It seemed like a no-brainer, but apparently I was wrong. Sometimes the interreligious encounter takes us to the edges of where we are comfortable, and those edges can be very sharp. A few years ago at the Yale Divinity School, I had the opportunity to hear a lecture by a man named Mohammed Abu Nimer. Abu Nimer is a Palestinian from Israel and is an academic and an authority on conflict resolution, particularly in the Middle East. He's also the director of the Peace Building and Development Institute in Washington, D.C., and he's led countless workshops on interreligious engagement in some of the most tension-filled parts of the world. He is a straight talker. He does not sugarcoat the reality of intergroup and specifically interreligious engagement. He'd seen it all. He's experienced deep defeat and despair along the way, and yet, remarkably, and why I'll never forget him, he's still at it. During his lecture, he described for us one of the most compellingly true ways to understand this process I've ever heard. He basically said that there are two ways we tend to think about interfaith dialogue and community building. The first is to imagine that you are looking through a window at a group of people in conversation from different and differing perspectives. As you look through this window, you are informed by their difference, you hear their perspectives, and you watch them interact. You are engaged by what you are seeing, you draw conclusions from it, but still you are not in it. Remember, you're looking through a window. It appears orderly and even inspiring. This is where most of us stand when it comes to encountering difference. We might seek out the window, be excited by its existence, and committed to regularly looking through it, but that is it. We do not see ourselves in the room. Then there are those who have decided to walk through the door and, as Abu Nimer would probably put it, be in the mess. In the room of so many differences are people who are in real conflict with one another, but they are also in relationship with each other. They are trying to build on these relationships, and they are learning about each other's tradition. They are open to the possibility of actual transformation because they are willing to be in the room and by design or fate in relationship with all the wonderful promise and tense compromise that could mean. This experience often leads to deeper understanding and, in some cases, a certain kind of true affection. He's seen this time and again in his work. He's realistic that this transformation cannot happen overnight. He is road-weary from the process, humbled by its weight, but persistent that it is essential to our continuing existence on this planet we all share. About 2 weeks after that young woman met with me to express her discomfort regarding the exercises of the IRLC, I had the privilege of convening a special dinner meeting with some Yale World Fellows, and again the members of this council. The World Fellows is a program that just finished its 12th year at Yale, and it brings together some of the most dynamic, emerging young leaders from around the world for a full semester. The Fellows interact with the Yale and New Haven community, and their presence is electrifying, challenging, inspiring, and often eye-opening. This event was no exception. One of the fellows who joined us was a young woman from Lebanon, and I invited her to tell her story. Her name was May Akel. She's founding member of the Free Patriotic Movement, advisor to the former Prime Minister and current Member of Parliament, Michael Aoun, and was raised just outside of Beirut. May spoke to us about what it was like growing up with a Jewish mother and a Greek Orthodox father in Beirut. Her siblings, aunts, uncles, cousins and friends were Jewish, Christian, and Muslim. She was very matter-of-fact as she spoke, offering frank accounts of what it was like to live in the midst of such plurality of faiths and obvious religious tension, and yet navigate within it in such a way as to not feel alien from any one community. She grew up and was formed in the messy room Abu Nimer is describing. It was all her community, her blood. When she spoke about religious tensions around the world, she marveled at how it appeared to her that all the religious communities seemed to think that God was speaking only to them. At a young age, because of how she grew up, May came to the early conclusion that this was impossible and that God's voice could not be segregated by tradition. Rather, the traditions were segregating God. God was theirs and no others. This made no sense to her, and she concluded it probably made even less sense to God. I wondered what the student I had mentioned earlier to you might be thinking. Had we hit another sharp edge? It is so very tempting to hide, to retreat within one's own religious community, suspicious of others, protective of one's own. I see it all the time. People fear that they are disloyal to their beliefs or to the others in their community if they are in an appreciative relationship with others who live within different spiritual realities. To some, the Christian call to evangelize is understood to mean something that might indeed end in separation if one is not persuasive enough. In our well-meaning attempts to be committed people of faith, we are often misappropriating our own agency with God. There are those who fear a kind of relativism or a reduction of what they hold most sacred and fundamental to their own religious understanding. This is precisely where things can break down. We are tempted to retreat, to separate, and to try not to even imagine what could come next. The late theologian Letty Russell both lived and studied the notion of the common table. Emily had the great blessing of knowing her well. In her work and in her life, she framed this table as a place where difference and hospitality dance together with an end result that often leads to gratitude for space and time, and most importantly, for one another. Letty wrote, "Hospitality can become a third thing around which partnerships are formed as each of us welcomes another. This mending of creation, as Letty would put it, is not about us helping others to be like us. It is about allowing for others to be alive in the fullness of God's own love for them. We must hear, see, and touch the hurt to cultivate holy hospitality. To truly understand the act of compassion, we must have a hand in blessing this space." This is one of my favorite photos. This is a staff member, our business manager, and a student. This student actually graduated from Yale in 2011, went and studied Arabic in Jordan, and came back and wanted to give a year of service to the chaplain's office before applying to medical school. He's now at Duke. And when I asked him why, he said, "I want to give back. I want to give back to the chaplaincy. I want to give back to the place that brought me to a kind of fullness." And they're both smiling. What are they doing? They are shampooing the prayer rugs in the Muslim prayer room. If we had sound, you'd hear beautiful music playing in the background. But this is a true thing. This is the embodiment of a kind of hospitality that I'm trying to explain. Back in New Haven, in a staff meeting of very well-educated people, the chaplain's office staff, there is a spirited discussion taking place about the importance of finding halal marshmallows for Rice Krispie treats that need to be made for an upcoming event. We then start to focus on the Do a 180, our bi-weekly service program that we organize for students from different religious communities to perform a kind of service for 3 hours for 180 minutes on Friday afternoons at a shelter in the city. When can we fit it in? Well, right after Juma prayers, because they'll end at 2 p.m., and before sunset in time to greet the Sabbath, of course. Why do we think about these things? Why should we bother? It is that third thing Letty Russell talks about. It's the thing that we have come to cherish, this common table that we seek to set well every day. These are Buddhist nuns, just doing a kind of finger painting with some of our students in a space we call breathing space, where students are free to come and go. There's a lot of coloring that goes on. Usually Thursdays at 4, it's cookies and coloring with the chaplain. I told Emily that. At this table, this day was arts and crafts with Buddhist nuns. Ian Oliver is one of my most valued colleagues in chaplaincy. Ian is the pastor to the University Church at Yale and the senior associate chaplain for Protestant life. He's a brilliant preacher and a nimble thinker. I seek his advice often, and it's a rare day when I don't heed it. A few weeks ago, he sent me a document he was working on called Random Thoughts on Being a Liberal Protestant Approaching the Interfaith Table. Again, in the interest of full disclosure, I've been relentlessly picking Ian's brain as I try to construct this semester-long religious literacy course for the Divinity School, knowing that most of my students will likely be Protestant. I wish to highlight 3 of his 9 points here. If you want to hear the other 6, invite him to Nashville. He'd love it. I offer these 3 points as an effort to kickstart our later conversation. His first point. We don't own the interfaith table. Sometimes, as the largest and oldest religious group in America, we assume that it's up to us to invite others into interfaith dialogue and to set the terms for it. In terms of social privilege, we may have the power to do so, but the interfaith encounter requires that we consciously set it aside for a time. Being hospitable is essential, but not if it presumes that we are inviting others into our house as guests. Sharing ownership of the table and its etiquette creates a truly open space. I would add, there's a particular process involved with this notion. We must think about physical spaces, food, gender considerations, language, and so on. Coming to understand ourselves as all guests at this table works best if our collective equilibrium feels slightly off a bit. What I mean is I try to create a space that leaves room for mystery, where we do not know exactly how things will end up. The space must feel inclusive, safe, and perhaps pleasantly surprising. You can ask me more about that later. Ian's next point. We don't get to define others. Especially with our Jewish, Catholic, and Orthodox Christian partners, we can be tempted to assume that our knowledge of the scripture or church history allows us to tell our partners what they believe or where they're wrong. It's important to allow our partners to define themselves first and present our assumptions about what they believe as assumptions they may wish to challenge. It's also fair, though, to ask for the same courtesy when others presume things about our tradition. This came to light once again for me most recently in a discussion that I was having with a secular humanist student who felt completely misunderstood and appeared somewhat alienated from those who belonged to religious communities. I was going to great lengths to try and reassure him of the genuine welcome that I wanted him to feel with our programs when I remembered that I had heard similar things from students who identified as members of a religious organization, and yet they felt as if they didn't belong in conversations with secular humanists because they were told they were supernaturalists and that this label felt quite odd to them. Before anyone can even imagine themselves at the table, they need to feel safe. They need to feel as if they will not be judged through a narrow lens, and this cuts both ways. In the case of the humanist student, he must not assume that he understands what or how religious people believe, and the same needs to apply in the other direction. Not only do we need to set aside assumptions, we need to understand that we are only speaking from our own experience and not as the official spokesperson for our community or our tradition. Ian's third point. Exoticizing the other. It's not really a word, but we'll use it. One element of our privilege can be an assumption that our ways are normal and the ways of others are quaint, fascinating, or bizarre. It's important to let what is different just be different, without first imagining how it might relate to our own religious world. Sometimes as Protestants, we get tired of our own spirituality of hymns, prayer, communal worship, etc., and get personally excited about Zen meditation or yoga. Our partners, however, usually expect us to live in our own traditions rather than borrow theirs. Of course, traditions are not walled compounds, and the crossover and sharing is fascinating, but we need to first be clear about where we're coming from. So now here's my second when we do not know what we do not know story. Last year, 2 bright and enthusiastic graduate students, both of them Christian, came to a member of my staff and asked her if they could create some Tibetan sand mandalas on one of the quads. They thought it would be a beautiful thing for the community to experience the creation and ritual deconstruction of these fragile, colorful designs that Tibetan monks work tirelessly and meditatively on. When asked about their connection to the Buddhist community and how that community felt about doing an event like this, their faces went blank. It had not occurred to them to think about reaching out to the community for whom this is actually their sacred art. They were rightly moved by the beauty of the tantric ritual, and their motivation was well-meaning in that they hoped others could share in something so moving. They just felt short of understanding that this was not their ritual to appropriate, and that another community was again vulnerable to a kind of exploitation. I'm going to conclude with a bonus story because it leaves one feeling hopeful about the transformative power of true interreligious engagement when there's a passion for religious literacy, a passion for getting it right. This is a story I like to call Jesus is in the Sukkah. I do love listening exercises. I do them regularly with the interfaith student groups. These exercises stretch them and invite them into a way of understanding how well we must listen while we're at the table. I try to emphasize that they need to listen to each other as if they are in an organic chemistry class and fervently trying to get a grasp on foreign, complicated material. They must listen with an ear to get it right, and to not be listening for how their understanding of the material differs from the one who is speaking. One such listening exercise I use is like the old telephone game, where one person tells something to another and they pass it on. I usually do this exercise twice a year, once at the beginning of school and again at the end. Their first pass at this exercise usually has a dreadful end, and they're embarrassed. I find it to be a perfect opportunity to dig deeper into the notion of what it means to truly listen well. After a year of being in the midst of a variety of interreligious engagement opportunities, their listening improves tenfold. On this particular night, at the end of an academic year, we put up 6 large sheets of poster paper on the walls throughout a spacious meeting room. On the top of each sheet, there was a different religious term or holy day written in the form of a question. For example, one question was, what is the Trinity? Another, what is a sukkah? Explain the Buddhist wheel of Dhamma. You get the idea. I then invited 6 students from the traditions referenced on the sheet to come forward and stand by their respective spots. They had become the experts. They were the professors, and were preparing to give 1 or 2 sentence answers to the questions on the poster paper. I then invited the others in the group to disperse around the room and to go up to the experts one at a time and listen to the answers. After listening, it was their turn to be an expert, and they gave the answer to the next person, and so on. This would go on until every student had made it to every station. I was watching closely. I was enjoying the chaos, the holy chaos of chatter. These students were intent on getting it right. I remember the vivid image of a Muslim woman speaking with great animation, trying to explain the Trinity to a Hindu. It felt like magic. Then, one of our evangelical Christian students came up to me quite upset. He had this pained look on his face. He had overheard the latest description of the sukkah, and something wasn't right. A sukkah is a temporary dwelling that is built outside of Jewish homes and synagogues and centers during the Jewish holiday of Sukkot. Jews try to eat at least one meal each day under the sukkah. It dates back to the times in ancient Israel when Jews would build huts near the edges of their fields during the harvest season. All the materials of this are natural. He said, Sharon, someone has put Jesus in the sukkah. I was trying to stop myself from bursting into laughter, but I replied as gentle as I could, oh my. In my mind, I'm wondering, who put Jesus in the sukkah? Was it the Catholics? Had someone started to describe the sukkah as a manger? My imagination was running wild. In the meantime, he very politely said, my turn is coming up. May I have your permission to get him out? At the end of the exercise, the remaining students gave the answers to the prompts on the poster paper. None of them actually belonged to the religious traditions they were speaking about at that point, and they each got it right. Jesus had left the sukkah. True story. The late great theologian and interfaith pioneer Ramon Panakar often taught that when we can learn to take one another as seriously as we have come to take ourselves, then we will have made true progress in the world of interfaith understanding. That young man showed me the delicious promise of what was possible when he took someone else's tradition as seriously as he took his own. And Letty Russell would surely have noted that he was indeed lending a hand at the task of mending creation. Some more pictures. So these are some pictures that are taken on our alternative spring break trip to Washington, D.C. We take about 24 students for a week. And during the day, we do service work. Usually it's renovations. And then at night, we take them each night to a different sacred site. So this was their first visit to a Gurdwara, a Sikh temple. It's a young Buddhist student with... This is the house we worked on. This is Holi, which is a Hindu holiday that we celebrate off the calendar. Actually, we celebrate it the last day of classes in the spring. And it's grown. And these are just some of the beautiful people that... So this was the result of a Bible study. The Orthodox Jewish students and Yale Students for Christ had been meeting every week over supper in the Hillel building, in the Slivka Center, going through Bible stories together. And many of the Jews had been to Israel, and so they started to describe the sites and to the Christian students, and they got the idea, let's go. So they found a funder, and they went last spring break, and it was a life-changing experience for everybody. This is Diwali. You know, the Ministry of Gastronomy runs through all this work. So Suhoor at the Chaplain's house, that's a 4:30 a.m. breakfast before the fast starts during Ramadan. And then we do a lot of work with pancakes. And that's Ian serving chili with me. So thank you. Yeah, we'll be happy to take questions. Oh, hi, Rachel. I just saw you. Anything upsetting that you heard that you want to talk about a little?
I'd love to
Yeah.
hear a little bit more about the students who came to do the sand ritual.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's the ongoing question in a religious encounter.
Mm-hmm.
But there is a dimension of entering into another religious practice that might open up an experience of God or
Mm-hmm.
whatever your insert term here. So how do as a chaplain in your role, how do you navigate or introduce students into the participation in another tradition's ritual? And what kind of the entry path, attention while they're in it, and how do you navigate that?
Well, first of all, you bring in people who are part of that community, and you invite the conversation. I mean, the role of the chaplain is really, I mean, sometimes we joke, we set up the chairs, and then we see what happens. And you invite the right people to the table. I would never want to presume that there's going to be some sort of transformative experience for a non-Buddhist encountering this, but I also want to offer an education that has integrity and isn't just borrowed. Last Thursday, we did an event where we had a Catholic nun who is an expert in contemplative ritual and a Buddhist nun sit side by side and talk about meditation and contemplative exercises in their traditions. And then we explored where there was some crossing over and where they were like, oh, not quite the same. And then we also then turned the conversation to, and what does mindfulness have to do with it? You know, and where, because there's a lot of talk about mindfulness now and in terms of meditation. And so it was very, very powerful because the people who were able to finally make the distinction that you can't be a Christian and a Buddhist. And that was what the Buddhist nun was saying very strongly, that, you know, she finds that hard to imagine as a Buddhist, as a practicing Buddhist. Whereas Christians would say, but I'm borrowing something that enhances my prayer life. Well, okay, but say that you're borrowing it. Don't call it Christian, if that helps. Yeah. Hi. Oh my gosh. Brittany, you were in the room.
I used to be a student.
She's from Johns Hopkins. I thought you looked familiar.
The question I have for you, so this particular discussion is about understanding that you don't know everything.
Yeah.
What do you do when you have a student who's a convert of another religion? How do you deal with that internal struggle when they've made the conscious decision not to believe, not to agree with another faith, but they are aware of that faith, they know that faith, and have now moved on to a different faith? Have you ever had that as an internal conflict, and how to mend that kind of internal conflict disagreement?
Well, I have.
As far as relating to focus groups.
Well, I think I've had students who have converted to Judaism that were raised in Christian homes and felt a strong Christian identity until they'd stopped. And I'm thinking of one in particular who really, she treaded lightly with her family, because it was painful, it was difficult, and there were many, many questions. What does this mean for Christmas? How are you going to eat with us? All those kinds of things if you're deciding to keep kosher. I think they're doing fine because they operated from a place of love. At the end of the day, they loved her, and realized they didn't know what they didn't know. You know, they felt safe asking questions. What do you need? She wasn't leaving saying Christianity was bad for me. She was going to something that she felt she was meant to be in.
Have you ever had I guess I'm looking at the student's perspective, interacting with the group that they've left from.
Uh-huh.
Like, have you ever had anything that, and I'm thinking of one particular example from Hopkins, and that's the reason I'm asking is how you deal with, say, a student who grew up Christian and converted to Muslim, but then, and now suddenly feels, I guess, almost animosity or like you're incorrect, and cannot bridge that understanding aspect of it because they made the conscious decision not to be a part of that group.
I think that there isn't one story here. Sometimes converts can be the most over-enthusiastic of a community. I see that in my own community with Catholicism. or people who become Catholic and they were raised maybe in some other Christian sect, but they all of a sudden turn a blind eye to some of the problems in the Catholic Church, and so it's difficult to have that conversation with them. I don't think there's one answer to that, Brittany. I mean, I really think it depends on the relationships that existed with the previous community and people's ability to communicate and also admit their ignorance. So often people hesitate to admit their ignorance when it comes to religion, and I'm telling you that's probably the first place you should, because so much damage is done when you don't do that, and people are hurt. Yes, in the back.
Sharon, we are approaching the Lenten season, and it's a time for us Christians to prepare for the holy suffering of Jesus, the Messiah, to unite the world under one God and one Lord and one faith. And I'm reminded of what Luke tells us in the 19th chapter when Jesus, looking from Mount Olivet across the Kidron Valley, and when he sees Jerusalem, Luke tells us that he wept, saying, "If only you people knew this day the things that make for shalom, make for unity, make for the wellness, prosperity, and harmony. Unfortunately, they're hid from your eyes." My question, Sharon, you being a chaplain of one of the top educational institutions in the world, Yale, I was a product of that community myself, 1986. Where do you see the failure of our ecumenical movement to try to unite people of different faith, people coming in as part of God's kingdom on earth? I see them as a beautiful garden. Imagine if we can unite them. Forget the differences. But if we can dwell on the common ground, I think we'll make a tremendous breakthrough if we can do that. I myself, I'm reminded of the Bhagavad Gita, a sacred teaching. However man may approach me, even so do I accept them, and whatever path that they may choose is mine. That is brought to us from the divine perspective. And is the failure more to do with us Christians being monopolizing on the truth? And you can remind me of your earlier theology that there's no salvation outside of a certain box. Can you elaborate on that?
I'm trying to figure out what the question exactly is.
What is the failure of our ecumenical
When you say our, what are you talking about?
The Christian.
The Christian ecumenical
Christian
movement.
reaching out. We come from different religious background. We have Protestant, we have Roman Catholic, we have Baptist, Methodist, Congregation, and so on. We all share the same mission, but we do it, individualistic. We do it on one own. Is it because before we reach our target, we already draw the line? You folks, we're not going to reach out to you folks because you look different, you sound different. Your theology does not, it's...
Are you, what is the failure? Is it the failure, name what the failure is for me, because that's where I'm trying to understand.
Yeah, I'm envisioning, I would like, there's no question that we live in a world that is torn apart by war and violence. And
Right.
some of these wars are done by people in the name of God.
Yes.
So when we are honest about reaching out and trying to do something to try and transform this chaotic world into at least get to know each other and respect another person's different religious idea and so on.
And I think there are a number of groups that are doing that. And that's the great hope, I think, on college campuses. We are blessed with a kind of rich diversity and a proximity to one another that invites a kind of relationship and development of understanding and hopefully appreciation across traditions. I see that just by virtue of how even North American society is changing. One of the best things that we do with this trip to DC is the visuals, is taking people down a street where there is a Cambodian Buddhist temple and a Hindu temple and the Gurdwara and so on and so forth, and exposing people to these things and saying, this is not foreign, this is right here. These are our neighbors. And our students they live with each other. They're in suites. They may have roommates who were born in Nigeria. They may have roommates who come from Eastern Bloc countries. All around, all these kinds of experiences are shared. And the great work of chaplaincy is it's this moment in their lives, this liminal point where they're examining what they were taught and their roots, and they're looking around and they're also coming into an understanding that theirs isn't the only reality. So I'm more hopeful that if we can have a number of positive activities, positive relationships, and teaching opportunities, we're going to get somewhere. I really am. I think Emily's signaling me.
Yeah, looking at the time, and I thought, well, maybe we could do one more question, but I think we need to honor the time and your time. I would like to first thank you very much, Sharon.
You're welcome.
And I would now want to welcome you to a reception that's just down the hall and to the right in Tillet Lounge, for those of you who need a little more bread for the journey for the rest of the evening.
Please do take a calendar. This is something we produce every year that explains religious holidays.